I listen to a lot of hip-hop. Like, a lot of hip-hop. But lately, I've said, you know what, fuck it. Now is a better time than ever to diversify my music taste a little bit and listen to some things that I wouldn't usually. For some context, here's a list of my top 40 albums of all time at the beginning of the year. If you take a look, there's only 6 non-hip-hop albums, and half of them are Radiohead, so I don't even really count it. But my most recent list actually has 13. It's not the best, but it's an improvement for sure. And if you look closer at my most recent list, you'll notice that a new band makes 2 appearances. And that's because about a month ago, I decided that I wanted to listen to the entire discography of one of the most notorious and critically acclaimed post-rock groups there is, Swans. And then I realized that they have like 15 different albums that in total range to about 17 hours of music, and so I was worried. But you know what? I stuck through it. I listened to every single studio album from Filth to Leaving Meaning. So, what's the point of this video? Because goddammit, I did not listen to 15 different albums just for nothing, okay? Look, I know that there's a lot of people out there like me who try to focus on only one genre at a time. For me, it was hip-hop. That was my entrance to music. But I'd like it if this video were to encourage you guys to go out and discover new music and maybe even start with Swans. And so if you're watching this and you're curious at all, this can kind of be a guide to you to figure out which Swans albums to start with, because let me tell you right now, there are a lot of them that you don't want to start with. I also really want to rant about how bad The Burning World is. I really don't like that album. So without further ado, let's turn the clocks back all the way to May 27th, 1983, and talk about one of the most aptly named albums I've ever heard. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that Swans is a post-rock group, which is kind of only half true. While the majority of the music that they have made is considered post-rock, their earlier music was a lot grittier and had a much more post-punk feel. The band said that the name Swans fit their music perfectly because, quote, "Swans are majestic, beautiful-looking creatures with really ugly temperaments," end quote. At this point in time, the band included Michael Gira on bass and vocals, Jonathan Cain and Ruli Mosaman on drums and percussion, Norm Westberg on guitar, and Harry Crosby on bass with Gira. The best way I can think of describing this album is like scraping your knee on hot concrete, except in the best way possible. Each song is just filled with so much anger and angst, you can just feel it in the music. I do have to say, however, that my least favorite part about this album has to be the song endings. Each song always either ends in a fade out, or in the case of Big Strong Boss, it just kind of stops abruptly in the middle of the song, like out of nowhere, and I'm sure that's intentional to some extent, but that doesn't change the fact that I just don't like it. And while the album flow does lower the score for me quite a bit, I do still like this project a lot. Filth is, in my opinion, the best place to start when you're listening to Swans discography. It's a little brash, it's a little gritty, but it perfectly encompasses the vibe of Swans' earlier music, as well as allowing the viewer to see where Swans started out, because it makes their later work so much more impressive. Because trust me, shit is gonna get a whole lot different, a whole lot faster than you think. But before we talk about that, we have to talk about Cop as well. I know that this is a bit of an unpopular opinion because most people that like Filth also like Cop, but I really was not a fan of this album. Cop came out a year after Filth, and it features similar style and tone to its predecessor. This album also marks the group's first lineup change, as Jonathan Cain left the group shortly after Filth was released. I think the reason that I didn't like Cop as much as Filth is mostly because of the tempo change. Everything about this album was more intense except for the speed, and because of that, it just felt like Michael Gira was yelling at me behind background music. It just felt weird. And once again, whether or not that was intentional or not, I don't really care, because once again, I still did not like this album. And so after listening to Cop, I was kind of losing a bit of patience, I was still waiting for an album to kind of bring me back. In order to make me fall in love with Swans, I needed something different, because the way that they were going was not working for me. There wasn't any really drastic changes between Filth or Cop that made me think, oh, this is different. And luckily, this change would come with a new lineup change and also the addition of a new instrument. Look, I'm gonna be straight up with you, I really was not a fan of the next 2 projects either. But besides that, I do think that these 2 albums are very crucial to Swans' discography for 2 reasons. The first being that these next 2 albums feature the addition of a new member named Jarbo, who will soon become one of the most crucial members of Swans. The second being that these two albums feature the first introduction of the piano into Swans, which is my favorite part of these next two projects. Greed came out in 1986 and featured, as I mentioned again, another lineup change. Instead of having just one drummer, now they have three, none of which are their previous drummer. And of course, they also included the previously mentioned Jarbo, who at this point was just a background vocalist. But I'll reiterate, the most important part of this album was the addition of the piano. The piano on this album added so much more of a brooding and devastating feel to the Swans sound. Instead of creating an album that felt like scraping your teeth on the sidewalk, they were creating the soundtrack to the end of the world. And it wasn't great, in my opinion. But as someone who's listened to the entire discography, Greed was such a necessary step that Swans had to take to get to their future greatness. Holy Money came out the same year as Greed did, and was essentially a sequel album to the project. The only real difference that I could see between these two projects is that Holy Money featured a lot more piano, which, once again, I liked a lot, but it still didn't fix the project for me. Holy Money continued the themes of Money Bad while also elaborating on the sounds of the dark abyss that Swans had grasped onto. But Holy Money still left me wanting more. The piano and newly found female vocals had potential, but Swans just had to figure out a way to put those pieces together to create a modern masterpiece. So before you ask, no, neither of these albums are the modern masterpiece that I was talking about. But their 1987 album, Children of God, is that first major step towards achieving that. Children of God included sounds that Swans had never touched before, including the likes of gothic rock and even some neo-folk. It was also at this point that Jarbo started having a much bigger impact on the group, not only covering vocals but also playing the piano with Michael Gira. One of the major improvements that I personally heard on this album was much better album flow. Instead of fading out tracks or just outright stopping them, this project did a much better job of moving one track into the next. This album is also the first examples of Swans taking their earlier post-punk sounds and mixing it with their newer gothic rock feel, creating this intense and beautiful mix of piano and instrumentals and vocals. Swans had a solid release on their belt, starting to make music that was straying away from their punk roots. And then 2 years later, they decided to release a steaming pile of cow shit, The Burning World. Dear God, what a snooze fest. This album is on the shorter side with only 44 minutes of length, but it feels longer than even their 2.5-hour projects. There is nothing exciting about this record at all. No standout tracks, nothing. Just painfully boring performances on every single front. Even Gira disavowed this project later on in his career, and personally, I don't even blame him. It was at this point in the Swans discography that I found myself once again starting to lose interest. So far, I listened to 6 Swans albums, and I had only enjoyed 2, and even those 2 didn't score above a 7. I needed a really strong project to draw me back in, and to make me interested in what the group had to say. And thank God that I found it. 2 years after the disaster that was The Burning World, Swans released White Light from the Mouth of Infinity, which is the first of 2 albums that sound similar in theme and sound. This album takes the gothic rock sound found in their last 2 albums, but turns it all the way up to 11. In fact, at this point, it seems that Swans has almost all out ditched their punk sound and has instead just went for the softer rock feel. And it sounds fantastic. Up until this point in the Swans discography, this is easily their most grand and theatrical sounding project. This album also features some of my favorite Swan songs of all time, with tracks like Love Will Save You and Blind. This is also the first Swans album where we see Jarbo start to play a much bigger role in the band, playing the piano more frequently as well as being more involved in the composition and vocals. And my God, am I glad that she did. The piano at the end of the previously mentioned Love Will Save You is just so beautiful and grand and just very Swans-esque. This is also where I'm going to stop talking about lineup changes because the band just keeps getting bigger and bigger and more people are joining, and we'd be here for an hour if I were to include every single name that was involved in the making of these projects. But with that being said, a year after White Light from the Mouth of Infinity was released, its sister project Love of Life was put out. Love of Life is essentially White Light's much darker sibling, which you can see all the way down to the album cover. I said in my original review that this album felt a lot like White Light, but taken down 5 notches. It's very clear just from the opening tracks that Love of Life is meant to be much more brooding than the previously mentioned celebratory vibes on White Light. For example, White Light starts out with the sounds of a baby laughing, possibly even after birth, and then explodes into this grand orchestral section. But on the other hand, Love of Life starts out with the sound of instruments being knocked over, and then moves into a much more mediocre gothic rock song. But if there's one thing that these two albums proved, it's that Swans is capable of making beautiful post-rock music that's also unique to them. But the question that I had at the time was, could they make it consistent? Okay, so take everything that I said about White Light and then throw in a little bit of Filth, and then adding consistency, and you get the Great Annihilator. To me, this album feels like a last homage to their earlier works before Swans comes out of left field with their next project. The Great Annihilator does a beautiful job of taking the good out of their earlier works, the great out of their gothic rock era, and then mixing it to create this incredible hybrid. This album has something for everyone, whether it be the grittier sounds on Alcohol the Seed, the gothic rock vibes on Mind, Body, Light, Sound, or even Jarbo's vocals on Warm. I think this album often gets overshadowed by the record that precedes it because the next Swans album is easily their most critically acclaimed work to date. But regardless of that, the newer Swans sound would not be possible without this blend of the old and the new. This album also proved that Swans excelled in experimentation and that the more they leaned into it, the more successful they would become. Which leads us to the big one. I compare Swans' release, Soundtracks for the Blind, to the Lord of the Rings trilogy for a couple of reasons. The first being that, like Lord of the Rings, Soundtracks for the Blind is split into multiple parts as it is cut in half. I also compare it because of its similarities in both length and beauty. This album has a whopping runtime of 2 hours and 22 minutes, which becomes a theme with the newer Swans albums. And when it comes to the beauty of the album, this project is like the ultimate melting pot for so many different genres, whether it be industrial, post-rock, drone, ambient, and even vocal samplings. This album really does have it all. Swans uses a mix of elongated guitar chords, hypnotic vocals, and even cinematic-esque composition to create an album that some people would consider to be their best. And honestly, I can't disagree with them. This beautiful compilation of songs is everything that makes Swans unique. The genre blending, the songwriting, the feeling of grandness and theatrical composition. Soundtracks to the Blind clearly is the product of experimentation, trial and error, and putting up with Michael Gira in the studio. And it pays off in every way on this album. Except for the length. Look, going back to the Lord of the Rings comparison, this album's length became sort of a detriment to the project, at least in my opinion. The drony nature of the tracks sounds good, but after 2.5 hours of listening to the same note being played over Michael Gira's groaning, it gets old. But even with all that in mind, I still did love this project quite a bit. The vision for this project is clear, and it's executed in a way that makes for a great LP. However, Soundtracks to the Blind is a one-off for Swans. None of their albums before or after sound anything like this. And that's because right at the pinnacle of their critical acclaim, right after one of their greatest releases, they stopped. And the next Swans album wouldn't arrive for another 14 years. What is mine? After quite a long hiatus, Swans finally returns with once again a brand new lineup, and this time the biggest change is that Jarbo has left the band. The album, titled My Father Will Guide Me Up a Rope to the Sky, is one of those projects that's really just testing the waters. Swans stuck pretty close to home with this album, creating an almost entirely post-rock feel mixed with a little bit of folk. Which, don't get me wrong, is fine, but after a project like Soundtracks to the Blind, I was expecting more. After a 14-year-long break, it had become clear that the group had lost most of their charm and experimentation that they had found on their previous works. A lot of this project felt very safe for a Swans record, but I could tell that there was potential. If the group could come together and experiment like they did on Filth and White Light and Soundtracks to the Blind, I think that they could create something really special. And so they did. 3 times in a row. From 2012 to 2016, Swans released 3 double LP 2-hour-long albums, all similar in theme and sound. The first of the 3 is titled The Seer. Lead singer Michael Gira said that this album was 30 years in the making, and said that, quote, "It is the culmination of every previous Swans album, as well as any other music I've ever made," end quote. And The Seer delivers just that. Not only is this the beginning of what I consider to be the golden age of Swans, but it's also everything that the last project wasn't. Experimentation, check. Genre blending, check. A dog's butthole on the back of the vinyl cover, check. But in all seriousness, this was the album that I was looking for. Brooding, brash, moody, and of course it would not be a Swans album without the theatrics. This record also started the trend of having extremely long songs on each of the Swans albums, with tracks like the title track, which is 30 minutes long, or the last song, which is 25 minutes long. But despite these long songs, or even the total runtime of the album, which is 2 hours, I never felt bored. Unlike Soundtracks to the Blind, I never felt obligated to keep listening. I just did. In fact, for all 3 albums in this trilogy, length never became a problem for me. Their next album, To Be Kind, which infamously got a 10 out of 10 from the Melonhead himself, came out just 2 years after The Seer and was as incredible as a record as the last. To Be Kind features the brazen sounds found on The Seer, but expands on them. The biggest positive on this album, in my opinion, is once again the piano. The way the harsh notes drive the tracks forward is just downright disgusting in the best way possible. Michael Gira's vocals are also in rare form here, with his infamous lines on She Loves Us, and even more examples of him being as angry as ever. But aside from that, there weren't any huge leaps in sound from The Seer to Be Kind. But how would they wrap up this legendary post-rock trilogy? With my favorite Swans album of all time. Insert The Glowing Man. This album is unapologetically a 10. I wouldn't change anything about the tracks, I wouldn't rearrange the order, nothing. I wouldn't touch it if my life was on the line. Because The Glowing Man is a modern masterpiece of post-rock insanity, and it deserves to be framed and put in a museum for generations to come and ogle at. Too much? No? Each track on this project seems so calculated and precise. Every note and instrument is so perfectly inserted into the track to add to that moody feeling that comes with the album. And that moody feeling is so meticulously built up to add to the explosions on tracks like Frankie M and the self-titled The Glowing Man. These 3 albums put together just show so much how each individual in the band is so incredibly talented. It shows that when Swans continuously pushes the boundaries of music, when they push away their older sounds and grasp towards newer ideas, it comes out sounding unique in ways that I couldn't even describe. So, coming off one of the greatest 3-album runs in history, with all the pressure of the fans, would Swans do it again with their last album? Will they end this video on a high note? Okay, I'm being a little harsh, okay, let me elaborate. Swans' 2019 record, Leaving Meaning, isn't bad by any means. It just suffers heavily from a couple of problems. The first being that it had to follow up 3 of Swans' most critically acclaimed projects ever. But there's more here than just following up good albums. One of my biggest problems about this record is that it has some amazing songs on it. For example, What Is This is one of my favorite Swan songs of all time. But this album also has so many examples of songs that feel borderline unnecessary. For example, the last track, My Phantom Limb. The previously mentioned What Is This is the second to last song on the album. Now I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. Picture what an album closer usually sounds like. It sounds like the final piece to a puzzle. It leaves the listener on a high note. Now open your eyes. That is exactly what Is This sounds like. It would have been such a great ending to the album, and then they added in this totally unnecessary and mediocre My Phantom Limb, and it's annoying because I wanted that closure. I wanted to feel those final notes seeping out, and then of course it just comes right back in. Another problem that I have with this album is just the song Sunfucker, which sounds like the entire band joined a horny cult. It's weird. I don't like it. I don't know. I don't know. Look, I still do like this album, but I just had higher expectations, that's all. And I think that when you're going to create projects like To Be Kind, when you're going to create projects like Soundtracks to the Blind, when you're going to create... That rhymed. That triple rhymed. What? My point is that when you create projects like Swan's previous works, you can no longer put out albums that people just like, because then they're going to start comparing it to your masterpieces, and your ratings are going to go down. Which, look, isn't the end of the world, but I'm just saying that people aren't going to like it as much. But with that being said, that's the most recent Swans album we have, and up until this point in the script, there was no word of a new Swans album. Until today. Thank God I chose today to record this, because today, Mr. Gira decided to post the track list for a future Swans album that is coming in sometime this year, I believe. But look, we have that to look forward to, and I can only hope that it's going to come out as good as the albums like The Seer, or The Glowing Man, or Soundtracks to the Blind. But until then, that's Swans. If there's one thing that I learned while listening to these albums, it's that Swans is most in their element when they're uncomfortable. The band itself is stuck in this cycle of pushing music forward and then getting comfortable, and then pushing some more and then getting comfortable again. And if they can continue to incorporate new elements, new ideas, and new sounds, I think this next album is going to be really good. But until then, we'll just have to see what Gira and company have waiting for us.